and honor the 50th anniversary of the Stonewall riot. A lot has changed or has begun to change over these years. Queer folks, good news, they are not generally considered to be mentally ill anymore. More people are acknowledging and embracing their sexuality and gender identity, both privately and publicly. And there's been progress in the general public's understanding and acceptance of at least some of our identities and in at least some countries. And some progress has been made in securing basic rights and legal protections. I say some, not because I'm ungrateful, but because I want to be honest. I'll joyfully confess that, oh my, that's a little bit too big of a picture there. I will joyfully confess that introvert that I am thrilled to walk in the pride parades, especially locally. It's meaningful to me to see such a visible reminder that there are so many of us, and to be able to affirm our humanity and to really insist on our right to live and love as human beings. But I can't ever forget that a lot of the progress we've seen has benefited folks who already had some measure of privilege and power, especially white folks, wealthy folks, able-bodied folks, and healthy folks. The equality that we've achieved hasn't been evenly spread among everyone in our community. And to be clear, I'm not just talking about the assault on the queer community currently being conducted by the Trump administration. The painful truth is that folks who have suffered the most and who have suffered the most often and who have been doing so much of the work for equality are also the people who are least likely to enjoy the gains. It's been 50 years now, and we tend to glamorize Stonewall. We forget that it was essentially a riot to protest ongoing police harassment and violence, and that it was Black and brown trans people who were leading the way and paying the price. It was folks like Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, and Miss Major. And without diminishing the courage that was shown at Stonewall, I think it's also important to remember the words that Miss Major has shared more recently. When she remembered Stonewall, she said, "The memory of that first night doesn't come to me with anything like joy or happiness, because so many of the girls and the few guys that were there got really hurt. After the city police barged into the bar with numbers and attitude, the feeling that was so prevalent that night was fear. Looking at the riot squad was like watching Star Wars stormtroopers, but they were in black with riot gear, sticks, guns, mace, helmets, and shields." Today, Black, Indigenous, trans people of color are still the ones who are leading the way. And they are still the ones paying the highest price. They are the ones who are at the greatest risk. As Tatiana Cozzarelli recently reported, 61% of transgender respondents in a 2015 survey in New York State reported that they had faced harassment by the cops. And a 2012 report of trans Latinas in Los Angeles revealed 24% of respondents had been sexually assaulted by the police. Closer in time, just the beginning of this month, this year's Pride Month, began tragically when Johanna Medina Leon, a trans woman and a migrant from El Salvador who was seeking asylum in the United States, died while in ICE custody. She died because ICE agents refused to give her the medical care she needed, despite weeks of asking for help. And she wasn't the first. As a society, and for all of us in the queer community, we have to do a better job of centering the voices, lives, and leadership of trans, Black, Indigenous people of color, immigrant, disabled, and similarly marginalized folks. Corporate sponsorships make for great street parties. There's no doubt about it. But they are no substitute for the work that must be done to make liberation a reality for every queer person. The best way to honor the 50th anniversary of Stonewall is to tirelessly work to build movements for justice that include and liberate us all, and that follow the lead of the people who have been doing that the longest and the hardest. So as I reflect on relationships this morning, I want as much as possible to do so in the spirit of that liberation. As I reflect on what we might learn from queer relationships, or at least what I've learned as a queer person, especially as it has to do with consent, I want to remember the folks who, in facing a world that still demands submission to dehumanization and oppression, have the courage to say no. I want to remember the folks who still teach us to insist on our right to exist and to reclaim our power as human beings. While my reflections this morning aren't directly about them, they are possible in large part because of them, and I'm grateful for that. When I say we can learn a lot about relationships by looking through the lens of queer experience, I want to make it clear that I'm not saying that all queer relationships are uniquely healthy, because that is clearly not the case. We're products of the same society as cisgender, heterosexual, allosexual, and alloromantic people, and we experience dysfunction, domestic violence, and painful breakups. Too often, our relationships are further complicated by the abuse and trauma that queer people are typically at a higher risk to have suffered. I'm also not saying that relationships that follow common cisgender and heteronormative social expectations are somehow lesser or don't have anything to teach us. But those types of relationships are almost universally assumed. That's what we encounter everywhere. And you have to go out of your way to find a different perspective. For example, when was the last time you saw a book for sale that focused on lessons on love from a transgender experience? Have you seen a book like that lately? They are out there, but you have to go out of your way to find them. And we have something to add. A variety of experiences and perspectives enrich all of us. As Rachel Davies has put it, it's not the case that LGBT relationships mirror heterosexual relationships, where there are predefined gender roles that can influence how men and women live together. LGBT couples can make it up as they go along and play to their strengths rather than to a gender stereotype. What you do and how you live your lives can be decided on personality and abilities rather than gender. Isn't that a lovely idea? And that's certainly been my experience. Like many of us, I was raised with cisgender and heteronormative expectations, and it really made life confusing and stressful for me. And for those of us who have had that experience, it's pretty common that we realize somewhere along the way, sometimes immediately, sometimes gradually, that we just didn't fit there. We didn't fit those expectations, and a whole bunch of that rule book just didn't even apply to us. It didn't make sense. So we didn't have a choice in the matter. We had to look deeply at society's assumptions. And we had to assess what was healthy and helpful and what was unhealthy and unhelpful. Nothing could be assumed. And I come back to Davies' words. We've learned that what you do and how you live your lives can be decided on personality and abilities rather than gender. We've done so, we've created a space to do so in the face of enormous pressure and backlash. We've had to carve out that space for ourselves. We do it imperfectly, and too often we do it tragically. But I do believe our combined efforts have fashioned a beautiful tapestry that it just radiates with love, community, and acceptance. There's plenty to be proud about. There's plenty to celebrate, and there's plenty to remember with gratitude and hope. Our collective wisdom has a lot to offer about what it means to love and be loved, and how to translate that into healthy relationship habits. But I want to hone in on one particular lesson and talk about that from my personal perspective. And because it's a lesson that I couldn't fully learn until I embraced my queer identity. And that lesson was on consent. Consent is about shared respect and trust. A crucial reason we have as a larger culture such a difficult time with consent, as you can tell by things like the Me Too movement, when it comes to sexual encounters, is because we don't practice consent very well in everyday life. Think of how we often treat children. We spend their entire childhood telling them that they have no control over their bodies. This is a personal pet peeve of mine, when we tell children they have to hug someone. I don't know if you've noticed that. You have no choice. I don't want to hug that person. You have to hug give them a hug. Sit on their lap, right? We tell their entire childhood that they don't get to have that choice. They have to spend time with a person against their will. As a society, we're not very good at listening. And as a general rule, I think we fail to listen to children. Even when something is genuinely bothering them, what I often hear is, be quiet. don't cause trouble. And then we're surprised when they grow up and struggle with consent when it comes to sex. Of course, rampant prejudice makes things worse, including gender and sexuality phobias. One of the most powerful and terrifying cultural teachings that I learned about consent came from the 1986 film Crocodile Dundee. I was 10 years old when I first watched it, trying to make sense of my own non-binary gender identity in a very binary gender world, and there was just almost zero information available for me. In one scene, Mick Dundee is getting drinks at a crowded New York City bar, and he starts flirting with a woman named Gwendolyn. And things seem to be going really well until a friend takes Dundee aside and says, "I've been trying to tell you all night. That girl, she's a guy." Mick responds by sexually assaulting Gwendolyn. He grabs her. He then points at her and announces to the entire crowded bar, "A guy dressed up like a Sheila. Look at that." And the crowd responds with laughter, clapping, and high fives. Gwendolyn runs away with that look of terror and shame on her face. That was a comedy, right? That was played for laughs. That's the most enduring memory I have from that age of my life of what it looked like to be gender nonconforming, to be a trans person. That brief scene reinforced a lot that I had already learned. Trans folks are not allowed to exist, but when they do exist, it's as the butt of a joke. Sexually assaulting and humiliating trans folk is socially acceptable and may even get you some cheers. I learned it was not safe to be myself, but that I would be expected to laugh with the others as the price of trying to fit in. I grew up thinking about Gwendolyn. I don't remember much about that silly movie, but I knew exactly what to look for when I went looking for the clip of Gwendolyn. Her face was stuck in my memory as a symbol and reminder of just what the world thought about gender nonconformity and what that meant if I wanted to survive. Years later, I also began to see what these types of lessons meant to others, and maybe to see a little bit of why we struggle as a society on what really should be very basic lessons about consent and respect. Because if you grow up being taught that someone in a position of power can give you a command and you have to do it, even if you don't think you should do it, and even if you say no, guess what happens? And you grow up and you are now in a position of authority. You believe that when you give a command, another person has to do it, even if they don't think they should, even if they say no. And guess what happens if someone with authority tries to take advantage of you? You've already learned to let them do what they want. To fight back means to break the rules. And so we create a society of people predisposed to be victims, bystanders, and perpetrators. As a society, we have confused power and consent. And I want to put it plainly, power is not permission. Your command is not someone else's consent. Crocodile Dundee, you can probably tell, Crocodile Dundee still makes me angry, and it makes me sad. But the happy news is that humans have evolved as social organisms, and we have this wonderful ability to talk about things, to talk with one another. We have the ability to be intentional about how we create and how we sustain relationships. Since our relationships can and do, they must change over time, consent is not and can never be permanent. It has to be ongoing. We have to check in with each other. We have to pay attention to my needs, your needs, each other's needs, and to the ways the relationship can or cannot meet those needs. Instead of making commitments to static, unchanging relationships or to some unchanging ideal about what a relationship should be, we have the freedom to make mutual commitments to both our shared and personal well-being. And I think that is an incredibly beautiful thing, to be on that journey together. At least from my perspective, one of the most damaging assumptions that you find in our culture is the "I'll die without you" myth, right? I mean, we probably wouldn't have half the love songs or romantic movies if we didn't have this myth. So there's that. But also, in terms of impact on our lives, it can really confuse us. I've been in a committed relationship with Holly since 1995, and spending my life with her is the most wonderful thing that's ever happened to me. I can't exaggerate how important she is to me, and we've been through a lot together, and we have the photo albums. Before, we've been together so long, it was pre-digital, right? So we have crates and crates of photo albums to prove how much we've been through together. But one of the reasons our relationship has lasted so long and has endured so many rather drastic life changes is that we respect each other's boundaries and we value each other's consent. We had to learn that with each other because we had terrible lessons about it growing up, but we learned it. We listen to each other and we encourage each other to understand and meet our needs so each of us can live full and wonderful lives. And if there's something that Holly needs that is I can't do, we find ways to get that need met. Community, relationships with friends. It's important to both of us that we live full, rich human lives. Humans can ruin a lot of relationships just by forcing them to conform to some ideal that really only exists in our imagination. So we pay attention, we look and listen deeply, and we adapt to what works best and supports our well-being. That kind of creativity, though, can feel threatening to that one and only I'll die without you worldview. I think consent, this ongoing nature of consent, invites us to remember love isn't a limited resource. Humans have the capacity to love many people and express intimacy in many ways. We need robust connections and a lot of them. We can and should express love and affection to our families and friends. Unfortunately, our society has the tendency to sexualize every relationship, right? Combine this with all our insecurities and our gender and sexuality phobias, and you hear people, maybe not as much now as before, but you still hear people who catch themselves in a moment of tenderness, and no homo, right? No homo. Alienated from ourselves, from our desires, from our longing for human connection. Is it any wonder that so many of us spend our days in loneliness and despair? We surround each other, but we can't connect. It's like we live by the well, but we are dying from thirst because we never learned how to drink. And this is another reason why consent can be so difficult. Healthy relationships require healthy individuals. It's true there's a feedback loop here. A healthy relationship will make the individuals in that relationship healthier, and healthier individuals will make that relationship stronger and healthier, and so on. But you can't focus on a relationship to the neglect of individuals. Each person needs to take care of themselves. Otherwise, we don't know what our needs are. We don't understand ourselves, and we don't know what we need. If we don't know our needs, we can't ask for those things that meet our needs. We're left with a collection of bad habits we learned from a broken world or from our own traumas, and we go from unfulfillment to unfulfillment. We make guesses and we fail. We repress and suppress. We cobble together a collection of strategies that often relieve the pain, but we stagnate in our chronically unmet needs. This society here that we live in, it never gave me permission to be myself. It still does not give me permission to be myself. Instead, it demanded and demands my consent to repression and abuse. I had to learn how to resist, how to claim my identity and my voice. I had to learn, contrary to everything I was taught as a child, that I did not have to give my consent to harmful people or the harm that they caused. I could say no. I learned that forgiveness is about growth and not about tolerating destructive patterns in relationships. I learned that some relationships can be healed while others are broken, at least for a while. It takes wisdom and openness to discern what can be healed and what cannot, and when it can be healed and when it cannot. That's difficult, painful, but sometimes, and thankfully, beautiful work. That work is much more straightforward the better we understand consent and respect. In 2015, a Tumblr post by Autistic Abby put this in wonderfully simple terms. She wrote, "Sometimes people use respect to mean treating someone like a person, right? So that's respect means treating someone like a person. And sometimes they use respect to mean treating someone like an authority. Sometimes people who are used to be treating like an authority say, if you won't respect me, I won't respect you. And what they mean is, if you won't treat me like an authority, I won't treat you like a person. And they think they're being fair, and they're not, and it's not okay. I'll read that one more time. I think this is brilliantly put. Sometimes people use respect to mean treating someone like a person. Sometimes they use respect to mean treating someone like an authority. And sometimes people who are used to be treating like an authority say, if you won't respect me, I won't respect you. But what they mean is, if you won't treat me like an authority, I won't treat you like a person. And they think they're being fair, but they aren't, and it's not okay. In the end, this is what all of this has been about. Treating one another like people, like the incredible, amazing, unlikely humans that we are. Those fierce and fabulous trans women of color who threw bricks and rocks at Stonewall were saying it's not okay to treat us like we are less than human beings. And it's still not okay. It will never be okay to dehumanize us with petty prejudices that reduce living, breathing beings to our genders and sexualities, to the color of our skin, to the age or health of our bodies, to our religions, ancestries, classes, clothing, or piercings. It really is this simple. Treat each other like human beings. Amen. Insist that we all treat each other like human beings. This is the heart of consent and the heart of community. Listen to yourself. Understand your needs. Understand your boundaries. And listen to one another. Respect each other's boundaries and needs. Ask for permission. Recognize it when we cause harm, and then do the work to fix it. Don't tolerate injustice. Don't be afraid to change. Work together. Live together, love together. We've made some wonderful progress in the last 50 years, but we have a long way to go. This is a time to learn both what we've done well and where we failed, and to keep moving forward. After all, the probability of any one of us existing is mind-blowingly low. And I want to spend my few days on this planet filling my lives and the lives of those around me with kindness, generosity, compassion, wisdom, and love. I'm hopeful, and I'm glad that you want the same things too. Thank you. Amen.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.